Serious, what is something scary that has happened to you that you cannot explain rationally? I live in a condominium and we own 2 apartments on the 7th and 8th floor. The only way to move in between them is to step out of the apartment, take the elevator or the staircase and enter the other one. One night, we ran out of ice cream upstairs and my mom told me to go get some from the downstairs freezer, so I took the keys to the 7th floor's apartment and since it was dinner time, no one was there. I walked into the pitch dark and realized that someone was sitting on the sofa, so I flipped the switch to see my dad just sitting there. It was kinda weird, but I just went to get the ice cream and asked if he had a key to lock up. No answer. I shrugged and thought, well, if he came in and locked the door behind him, he must have one. Went back upstairs and my dad was sitting there eating dinner. I freaked out and asked how the heck did he get up here so fast, and everyone told me that he's been here all this time. Told them it wasn't possible cause I just saw him downstairs, but no one believed me. Now I never go down there alone. I was home alone for a weekend a few years ago while I was still in high school. After school one day I was driving home, and when I passed in front of my house I thought I saw some old lady in white clothes in my sister's room looking through the window. I thought it was stupid, so I went in the room to check out what it actually was, but I couldn't find anything. I pretty much forgot about it until later that night I got a call from a very panicked and scared neighbor saying there was some old lady pacing back and forth in my sister's room. I still have no idea what it was, and I've never seen anything like it since. I used to work doing maintenance at historic properties. There was a historic house museum I worked at when it wasn't open to the public. It was part of a whole landmark site. There was a visitor center with offices and then the house was about half a mile up a dirt road in a wooded area. Sometimes I worked with a crew, but there were a lot of times I was there alone. One winter day, when it was really cloudy and dark, I was working alone to get ready to replace some electric work on the exterior of the house. I went inside and turned off the circuit to the whole property, and I tested it. It was off. I locked the doors and went outside to work. After about an hour, I got down from my ladder and started walking around the house, and then one of the lights inside the house turned on. I started to freak out, but thought that maybe someone was playing a joke on me. I called the visitor center on my walkie-talkie, and confirmed that the only other person who was working that day was still there and hadn't left, and that all the keys to the house were present and accounted for. That's when I freaked out and ran the half-mile up to the office. I made my coworker come back with me to check out what was going on, but when we got to the house, the light was off again but the bulb was still warm. All the doors were still locked and the circuit was still off. Still gives me shivers to this day. TL, Doctor, light turns on by itself in old house when the electricity is off, which is literally impossible and super spooky. When I was 6 years old, I had a cat named Buster. Buster was actually my stepdad's cat, but because I never had a cat before, I claimed him as my own. Suffice it to say, Buster didn't like being hugged and coddled all the time by a little child, so he hated me. He avoided me at all costs. He was also an outdoor cat, so he would often spend most days outside and then come in for the night. One night, Buster didn't come back in the house. We usually fed him at night, so I was worried. Our area was also well known for an abundance of coyotes. My parents were being a bit hush-hush about Buster's disappearance, but I didn't get the hint. That night, when I was drifting off to sleep, Buster jumped onto my bed. He lay down by my head and let me pet him until I fell asleep. Honestly, I was shocked because he had never done this before. The next morning, I triumphantly walked downstairs and related to my parents that Buster now loved me because he slept in my bed during the night. My parents looked at me inquisitively and sat me down at the breakfast table to let me know that while they were outside the night before, they had found Buster's body in the alley behind our house. They thought he had been harassed by a coyote. But, he was dead, so he couldn't have slept in my bed that night. To this day, I like to think that Buster just wanted to say goodbye and thank me for trying to love him in the only way a child knew how. My family owns a decent-sized horse boarding facility, and when we first had it going we used to do bed check as a family. Bed check is just making sure all the lights and fans were off as well as looking at the horses for injuries and if they had blankets during the winter. Well, we had just got back from eating out and it was a moonless night during fall. As we stepped out of the truck, this large light gray mass stood up and took off loping towards our pastures. It was about the size of a single cab pickup truck. It made no noises other than it hitting the ground as it ran. The only other proof that it was real to us was the horses that were turned out that night screamed and stampeded across the pasture it had jumped into. We did a double count of all the horses that night and not a single one was missing. I still have yet to see it again, and I hope I never do, or at least there is some explanation for it. When I was in uni I lived by myself. It was a nice little studio unit behind a house in a fairly decent area. I would honestly think nothing of walking places at night. There was a 24-hour McDonald's and a 7-Eleven that I would walk to, often between 12 a.m. to 3 a.m. since I was a massive night owl. Well, one day after finishing an essay at about 2 in the morning I decided I was hungry but didn't really have anything easy to cook, so I decided to walk down to the 7-Eleven and grab a pie or something. However, as soon as I opened my door I was overcome by a suffocating feeling of fear. My heart started pounding, I started shaking, the works. Telling myself that this was ridiculous, I walked out to the street with the intent to still go, but that was as far as I got. I was terrified for no reason that I could understand, but no less intensely despite that. I ran back inside and ate dry cereal. Later the next day I heard about a group of drunk guys that were causing havoc down near the intersection at the 7-Eleven. They'd beaten up someone from my uni. Even though I can't explain it, I'm convinced something bad would have happened to me that night if I had ignored that feeling and gone anyway. Probably too late, but better late than never. So much weird stuff like this has happened to my family over the years. Particularly with my mom. Below are a couple fan favorites. My parents had been married for maybe a month. They were in bed sound asleep when all of a sudden, my mom jumps up and wakes up my dad. "Jimmy. Jimmy. There's blood everywhere. We have to help them. Please." My dad tried his best to calm her down and figure out what she was talking about. My mom had explained that she saw a car with a German license plate on the side of the road. That there had been an accident and they needed help. My dad tried to console her, to explain that it was all just a bad dream, but she wasn't having it. So to appease her, they got in the car and drove to the spot my mom thought the accident was. And sure enough, at the exact spot my mom said, there was a car on the side of the road with German plates and emergency flashers on. Upon closer investigation, there was nobody in the car. If they needed help, help had already come. My parents had just had their first child, my oldest sister, Kathy. They had been living in Italy at the time. My dad was in the Air Force, and had brought her back to the US to introduce her to the grandparents, my dad's parents. So their first night there, my mom was asleep in the front bedroom, jet-lagged. My dad had gone out to hang out with his brothers. And in the middle of the night, this woman walks into my mom's room, waking her up. She sits down on the bed and says, "Shh, it's okay. I just wanted to welcome you to the family." My mom was scared, obviously, but figured this was some relative or family friend or something that came over. The woman walks over to the bassinet where my baby sister was sleeping. "Is this your daughter?" My mom nodded. "She's beautiful. It's lovely to meet you both." And then she leaves. My mom wakes up the next day and is having breakfast with my grandmother when she brings it up. "Who is the woman that came over last night?" My grandmother had no idea what she was talking about. My mom told her the whole story and my grandmother asked what she looked like. My mom said, she was tall, had long white hair and was wearing a blue dress. My grandmother's face went as white as a sheet. She rummaged through some old pictures and pulled one out. "Is this her?" she asked my mom, who nodded in return. "That's my mother. She's been dead for 20 years and we buried her in a blue dress." Probably too late, but here goes. I was working at a hotel in Albuquerque, the graveyard shift. I had been talking to the security guard and he asked if he could get a ride home, so instead of waiting for 30 minutes for my shift to end I just left and left a note for my boss that said I left early because my brother was stranded outside of town and needed me to get him. Total lie on my part, but I needed a good excuse to leave early. I drop off the security guard at his place, then go home and go to sleep. A couple of hours of sleep and I wake up to my phone ringing. It was my brother. He tells me he is stranded outside of town and he needs me to go get him. I tell my brother the lie I told my boss and how much of a coincidence his calling me is. He says that's not weird, he will show me what's weird when I get there. I get there and ask him what is weird. He puts his phone up to my ear and plays a message that he got when he woke up that morning. It's a voice that kinda sounded computerized but mostly just creepy sounding. It says, "You're stuck, freaked us both out." Never figured out where the call came from. Strangest, creepiest thing that's ever happened to me in my life. I'm a little late, but screw it. I was in first grade, hanging out at recess with a friend. He was shooting some hoops outside and I was playing DS, sitting on the pavement. I remember him asking me if he could make a shot from halfway across the court. I told him he could try, but he probably wouldn't make it while looking at my DS. Suddenly, my dad asks me what I mean, and when I look up I'm sitting on my living room carpet, talking to my dad, and it's dark out. I was sitting in the same position, playing the same game, same level, and same exact spot in the level. Everything continued normally that night, and I didn't tell anyone at the time, but looking back it is really freaky. I thought it was a dream for the longest time, but thinking about it didn't really feel like a dream, and I don't really remember dreams that well. TL, Doctor, teleported through space and time once. In 2002 I lived in the East SF Bay Area with my husband, and 2 toddlers. I was grieving over the sudden death of my mother a month before. She'd had a major heart attack and died at 52 years of age. On an average day, I left my babies at home with my husband to run a quick errand by myself. I drove a block over through downtown Hayward to hit up the grocery store. I was on my way home and stopped at a red light waiting to make a left turn. The intersection had all blind corners so it was difficult to see oncoming cars. My light turned green. I glanced both ways, waited the appropriate second and stepped on the gas pedal. It would not move. I tried again. Nothing. The car behind me honked. I looked down under my pedals quickly to see if something had possibly rolled under the pedal and found nothing. I looked up and suddenly a huge work truck loaded down with equipment ran his red light at what must have been 50 miles per hour. I was stunned. I gasped, quickly pulled myself together, stepped on the gas pedal and it worked with no hesitation. Suddenly I smelled my mother's favorite perfume. Really amazing experience. In 1975 I was flying an Army helicopter doing night training in blackout conditions near Fort Hood, Texas. I was flying down a draw with a small seasonal creek in it which was the new paradigm, designed to mask the aircraft from Russian radar. I was at the controls, my co-pilot on the map. We were low and slow treetop to treetop. Suddenly I had the compelling sure knowledge that I must do an emergency climb, which I did, climbing almost vertically. As I pulled the guts out of the aircraft and with my nose pointed up to the stars in my chin bubble I observed the leaves of a cottonwood tree being pressed aside by the plexiglass of my chin bubble. After a couple of seconds and now a few hundred feet above the canopy my co-pilot and I stared at each other with wide eyes and the knowledge we barely avoided death. "How did you see that fucking tree?" he asked me. I never did tell him that I didn't, because I have never known how to explain it. I went on to fly helicopters for 37 years, accident-free, and I still can't explain what happened that night. So, I was staying at my aunt's house in Mexico. My cousin's room had 2 beds so I slept in there. I remember not being able to sleep well and I had a bit of pain coming from my thighs. I had sweatpants on and somehow had scratches on my inner thighs. Almost like a bunch of cat scratches. My aunt came in and searched the bed for anything but never found anything that could have scratched me. She also noticed that I had a bit of bruising on my neck, as if someone had tried to choke me. It was just me and my cousin, definitely freaked me out and I rarely ever go visit my aunt anymore. If I do, I stay for a few minutes only. Sorry for bad formatting, I'm on mobile. After my grandpa died my grandma said she could feel someone getting into bed with her nearly every night, but we didn't believe her. One night I was watching TV in the living room trying to fall asleep when I heard footsteps in the hallway leading to my grandma's bedroom. I looked out into the hallway and couldn't see anyone, and this happened for probably a minute. Immediately after the footsteps stopped the TV turned off. I stayed awake for another hour or so but didn't hear anything after that. When I was little, I would go over to my grandparents' house frequently with my sister and cousins. My grandparents have an attached mother-in-law apartment, so we always played in there while the grown-ups would talk in the main house. One day we were playing hot and cold with a little key we found in the apartment. While one person was hiding it, they accidentally dropped it and it fell under the door to the basement. I opened the door to get it and when I did, there was a man standing at the bottom of the stairs that I didn't recognize. He had a bunch of stuff in his arms, like he had rummaged through my grandparents' basement. Keep in mind, my grandparents were hoarders, their basement was full of stuff that they either forgot about or put in storage, some of it being relatively valuable. When he saw me, he yelled at me, "Go back upstairs, kid. Go." I was so freaked out, I bolted and immediately ran into the main house to tell my parents. My dad went into the basement to look, but couldn't find anyone. To this day they all tell me I imagined it, but my sister and cousins insist it's real too. About 5 years later, both of my grandparents passed away, so I was helping my dad clean out their basement. Turns out they were missing a ton of stuff. I haven't gone back in that house since. My story was more like a glitch in the Matrix but still was pretty creepy. I'm really skeptical when it comes to various paranormal activities, But one thing happened couple of years ago that I can't rationally explain. So my father was picking me up from airport, we got into car, we started driving home. Then I remembered I left my small bag in airport toilet, so we went back, parked our car at guarded multi-level parking. We locked it, obviously. Even if we didn't, it locks itself after 30 seconds. When we came back, we found a tiny basket with raspberries in it, on a driver's seat. My father was sitting there 4 minutes ago. Obviously, we had no idea how the hell did they appear there. He didn't buy them, I didn't bring them with me. There was only one entrance to the parking guarded by parking guard, and he said nobody entered or left when we were gone. This story is now legendary among my family and nobody can explain it. Sorry for my English, not my first language obviously.